They say that maps tell stories, but sometimes those stories are incomplete. There's a portion of India's map, starkly etched, deliberately shaded, that has been waiting, not just for years, but for generations. That place is PoK, Pakistan-Occupied Kashmir. And this story, like all great stories, isn't just about borders. It's about memory, about sovereignty, about strategic intelligence, and the unbreakable moral arc of a civilization that refuses to forget what was taken from it. Today, we unravel a plan not born yesterday, but decades in the making. A plan shaped by two democracies, India and Israel, both forged in fire, both obsessed with survival, and both guided by a belief that history matters. When a nation is carved apart, what remains is not just disputed land, it's wounded memory. And memory, unlike geography, cannot be occupied. It resists. It survives. It passes through generations like an ancient scar that aches in silence, even as the world forgets where the cut was made. The story of Pakistan-Occupied Kashmir, PoK, is not a recent one. It is not a headline or even a line in a forgotten treaty. It is a story older than our independence, deeper than our borderlines, and heavier than our maps will ever reveal. In 1947, as the subcontinent bled from the chaos of partition, it wasn't just trains and homes that were torn apart. It was identities. Amidst the horror and violence, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was left to choose whether to accede to India or Pakistan. And while the decision should have been respected, what happened instead was a betrayal. Pakistani forces, dressed as tribal raiders, invaded the region, hoping to annex it by force before it could legally join India. In response to this violation, the Maharaja signed the instrument of accession, making Jammu and Kashmir a legitimate and constitutional part of the Indian Union. This is not rhetoric. It is documented, legal, and irrefutable history. But here's the tragic part. Even after this rightful accession, a portion of Kashmir remained under foreign occupation, not due to lack of courage, but because of a calculated choice made by India. A choice to believe in international arbitration, to respect ceasefires, to trust the global institutions like the United Nations would deliver justice. In hindsight, many have called it a mistake, but it was not weakness. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that only an ancient civilization can exercise, because civilizations are not defined by their reflexes, but by their capacity to endure. India could have pushed back then. It had the capability and the moral legitimacy, but it didn't because the leadership at the time was convinced that peace could be negotiated, that humanity would prevail, and that the world would eventually see the truth and act on it. That belief, unfortunately, was not reciprocated. What followed instead was decades of strategic deception, insurgency, and proxy war by Pakistan, using PoK as both a launch pad and a shield. While the bullets kept flying at the border, the real theft was of time, decades lost in diplomatic fog. But here's where the story changes. Strategic patience is not the same as inaction. It's not idleness. It's watchfulness. It's the kind of deep breathing a chess master does when he gives up a pawn, not out of fear, but because he sees 5 moves ahead. And that is what India has done. It has waited, it has observed, and it has remembered, because memory, when rooted in truth, does not fade, it sharpens. Every child born in the aftermath of partition who asked, "Why is that part of our land shaded differently on the map?" carried a seed of justice within them. And that seed has grown quietly, without propaganda, without coercion, into a national resolve that has now matured. That is what makes the story of PoK so powerful. It isn't driven by conquest, it's driven by continuity. It's driven by the knowledge that this land was never meant to be under occupation, not by legal mandate, not by cultural identity, not even by the basic spirit of freedom. There are families in India today who still have ancestral homes in Muzaffarabad and Mirpur. There are elders who remember the orchards, the rivers, the laughter on festival days, memories now overlaid with barbed wire and silence. And yet they do not scream. They wait, because waiting is not giving up. Waiting is remembering with purpose. And while we wait, we study, we learn, we build, we strengthen, not just our military, but our moral backbone. We send satellites into space, not bombs across borders. We negotiate trade, not vengeance. We rewrite our textbooks, not with hate, but with clarity. So that when the day comes, and it will come, when the map is no longer a wound, but a restored portrait, it will be restored not by bloodlust, but by truth. This is what distinguishes a civilizational power from a political state. The former doesn't panic when it loses ground. It doesn't shriek when it's betrayed. It remembers, and it plans, not in weeks or election cycles, but in decades, even centuries if needed. And this long vision, this slow burning determination is the very heart of India's approach to PoK, because India isn't interested in taking anything that doesn't belong to it, but it will never stop remembering what was taken from it unfairly. And that memory is now awakening, not in war rooms, but in classrooms. Not in street protests, but in satellite feeds and diplomatic forums. In every international discussion where India speaks, it now does so with the full weight of its civilizational claim. And that is far more powerful than any temporary territorial gain. So no, India hasn't forgotten PoK. It's just been waiting for the right moment. And that moment will not be born out of rage, but from the convergence of truth, time, and the unshakable weight of historical memory. And when it comes, it won't feel like a victory. It will feel like restoration, like the return of something that was never truly lost, only withheld, and finally made whole again. Wars are not always won with tanks. They're won with timing, with silence, with the right decision made in the right room at the right hour. Often without a single shot fired. India has long known how to fight wars, but now it is learning how to prevent them before they begin. And that shift, that evolution, has everything to do with what it has been quietly learning from Israel. Two nations, geographically distant, spiritually different, yet bound together by a strange and powerful commonality, both born into hostility. Both surrounded by enemies, both hated not for what they do, but for what they are. A defiant symbol of continuity in a world that expects surrender. Neither India nor Israel was ever given peace. They had to invent it, piece by piece, code by code, radar by radar. Israel, since its inception, had to survive with its back to the wall. No time to gather sympathy, no room to make mistakes. What emerged from that pressure wasn't just military muscle, it was military intelligence. It was a culture of readiness, of precision, of turning every threat into a case study and every battlefield into a laboratory. It had no choice. It had to get smarter, faster, colder, or it would be wiped out. India, for a long time, took a different path. It tried diplomacy. It tried dialogue. It even tried restraint, but the surgical strike in Uri and later the Balakot airstrikes marked a turning point. These were not just military responses. They were psychological declarations. India would no longer wait for body bags to stack before responding. It would act with precision, with intelligence, and above all, with clarity. This clarity has a source. It's in the playbooks that Israeli defense architects have written for decades. It's in the unmanned aerial vehicles that don't blink, in the spyware that listens when people think they are alone, in the satellite data that doesn't sleep. India didn't just buy Israeli technology, it absorbed Israeli thinking. That's the real alliance. That's the real transfer of power, not hardware, but mindware. Take drones, for instance. In the Himalayas and the desert regions near the line of control, weather and terrain make human surveillance impossible. But drones don't sleep. They don't feel cold. They don't ask for leave. And Israel built the world's best. Now they scan the Indian sky silently, watching, learning, every movement tracked, every pattern logged, one movement across the LOC. A launch, a leak, a whisper, and the information is routed, analyzed, and prepared for response in minutes. But it goes deeper. It's not just surveillance, it's anticipation. Israel taught India that it's not enough to react. You must predict, map the psychology of your enemy, understand their rituals, their pressure points, their cycles. Use data to preempt their rage before it becomes a rocket. India has now embedded that doctrine into its own military ethos, especially in Kashmir. It's no longer enough to defend the borders. The new strategy is make it impossible for the enemy to surprise you. Cyber warfare is another frontier where this friendship has turned into quiet brilliance. The world is distracted by bombs, but the most devastating weapons now are lines of code. One breach into a military server, one false signal in enemy radar, one invisible hack, and you don't just cripple a battalion, you dismantle a whole narrative. Israel has faced these threats longer than most and has built an ecosystem where prevention is as important as retaliation, and that's exactly what India has adopted. No more passive networks, every system hardened, every threat modeled, every response rehearsed. This isn't about copying, it's about learning. Israel doesn't give India solutions, it gives it questions. Difficult, uncomfortable questions that force Indian defense thinkers to evolve. What if your enemy knows your next move? What if your intelligence is 12 hours late? What if you need to strike but can't leave fingerprints? These are not academic puzzles. These are life and death blueprints. And in return, India offers something Israel deeply respects: scale, geography, manpower, strategic depth. Together they represent a new kind of alliance, not based on ideology, but on efficiency. They don't need to shout about their partnership. They don't hold hands in public. But beneath the surface, the machinery is humming, quietly, constantly, preparing for tomorrow. What makes this alliance emotionally profound is that it was never designed for spectacle. There are no grand parades, no military fanfare, only the quiet understanding between two nations that survival is not a gift, it is earned every day with vigilance, with code, with blood sometimes, but preferably not. And that's what makes the Indo-Israeli intelligence collaboration so powerful. It's not built on fear, it's built on clarity. Clarity that the wars of the future will not be fought where we expect, and they won't be won by the strongest, they will be won by the most prepared. So when we speak of reclaiming PoK, understand this: it won't begin with a bang. It may begin with a signal, a shadow in the sky, a gap in the enemy's data, a conversation intercepted before it ever becomes a threat. That's the future India is building, not alone, but with Israel, not through conquest, but through mastery. And that future, quiet, intelligent, relentless, is already here. Not every war is fought on the battlefield. Some are fought in rooms filled with silence. Some are fought with pens, not bullets, with trade, not tanks. Some wars are invisible, but they are no less real. And Pakistan, for all its military bravado, is slowly discovering that isolation can be more suffocating than open conflict, that what begins as diplomatic distancing can one day become complete irrelevance. There was a time when Pakistan stood tall at the global table. It was the West's favorite ally in the Cold War. It was China's southern gate. It was the self-declared voice of the Muslim world. It had leverage, it had connections, and above all, it had protection. When India spoke about Pakistan's betrayal in PoK, the world looked away. When Pakistan exported terror across the border, the West turned the other cheek because it needed Islamabad as a pawn in its wider game of power. But the board has changed now, and the pawns are being cleared away. What's unfolding today isn't the collapse of a nation, but the quiet dismantling of its influence. A slow, methodical isolation, piece by piece, connection by connection. And this is not by accident. This is design, a product of careful diplomacy, relentless economic repositioning, and strategic alliances. It is India playing the long game and playing it with precision. The shift began when India stopped explaining itself. For years, it pleaded with the global community to recognize what Pakistan was doing in Kashmir. It asked for support, for condemnation, for fairness. But over time, India realized something crucial. Power isn't asked for, it is assumed. And from that moment, everything changed. India changed the conversation. It stopped talking about the past and started showing the future. It became the world's fastest growing economy. It offered markets, not mourning. It offered partnerships, not protests. And the world listened, not because India shouted louder, but because it spoke with value. That's how influence is built, through relevance, through presence, through the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't beg for alliances, it creates them. One by one, Pakistan's traditional allies began to drift. The Gulf countries, once emotional supporters, now look to India for business, for security, for stability. Trade deals with the UAE and Saudi Arabia are growing. High-level visits between Delhi and Abu Dhabi, Delhi and Riyadh, once unthinkable, are now routine. Pakistan watches, bewildered, as its brothers embrace its rival, not because they've turned hostile, but because they've moved on. Economics has no room for sentiment. It follows gravity, and gravity today pulls toward India. Meanwhile, the West has changed too. Once dependent on Pakistan for strategic access to Afghanistan, it no longer needs that corridor. The war is over, the utility has ended, and the cost of tolerating Pakistan's duplicity has become too high. Every time a Western power looks at Pakistan now, it sees instability, debt, militancy, regression, and next to it, it sees India, democratic, disciplined, growing. The choice for most of the world has become simple. Even China, Pakistan's so-called iron brother, is walking a tighter line. The China-Pakistan economic corridor, once hailed as a game changer, is now bogged down in local resistance, security threats, and mounting debt. Beijing is no longer pouring money with the same enthusiasm. The returns are shrinking, the risks are growing, and India, through its broader Indo-Pacific strategy, is helping ensure that China's alternatives are increasingly limited. This is what geopolitical isolation looks like. It doesn't happen with a declaration. It happens with slow neglect, with declining relevance, with closed doors and unanswered calls. It's not about being attacked, it's about being excluded. And here's where Israel plays a subtle but powerful role. Israel knows this strategy better than most. For decades, it fought not just for territory, but for acceptance. It learned how to build bridges with countries that once wouldn't acknowledge its existence. It mastered the art of behind-the-scenes influence, of reshaping global perception, not with force, but with facts. That same model is now quietly guiding how India navigates its regional presence. Israel doesn't need to be India's public advocate. It simply stands behind it, offering intelligence, insights, technologies that make India indispensable. And together they understand something deeply strategic, that you don't defeat a country like Pakistan by destroying it, you defeat it by making it irrelevant. This is the genius of the current Indian strategy. There's no announcement of war, no formal mission, just quiet, consistent pressure. Remove the support systems, undermine the economy, showcase your own stability so clearly that the world forgets the chaos next door. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, but it's effective. Because one day, when the world asks, who does PoK truly belong to? There won't be a debate. There will be silence. And silence in geopolitics is not absence, it is consensus. And when that day comes, Pakistan won't be defeated in the way it fears, with jets overhead and tanks rolling in. It will be defeated in the way it never anticipated, by becoming a footnote in the very history it once tried to distort. That's how you reclaim what's yours, not just by showing strength, but by making your adversary unnecessary to the future. And that's exactly what India, with quiet partners like Israel, is doing. Every single day, there is a difference between conquest and reclamation. Conquest demands flags. Reclamation demands truth. One shouts with violence, the other whispers with memory. India's desire to see PoK return is not an obsession with land. It's a longing for justice that has matured into a strategic, disciplined plan, not to invade, but to restore. This isn't a war for territory, it's a war for identity. For decades, the narrative around Pakistan-Occupied Kashmir has been shaped by propaganda, misdirection, and fear. Maps were redrawn, voices were silenced, families were split. But the most painful damage wasn't physical, it was psychological. It was the slow numbing of a people who were told to forget the rivers, the hills, the old family homes in Muzaffarabad and Gilgit, told to accept that a piece of India would remain outside her arms forever. But memory doesn't obey politics. It refuses to die quietly. It survives in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. It appears in the names written on dusty trunks stored in Delhi and Jammu. It lingers in the language, the songs, the dreams. And now that memory is no longer just nostalgia. It is direction. It is purpose. India, unlike its adversaries, has chosen to act not from desperation, but from discipline, not from hatred, but from harmony. There are those who say that if India wanted PoK back, it would have stormed in by now. That's a shallow way to see a deep strategy, because this is not about military invasion. It's about about turning the world's gaze and Pakistan's own people back toward a reality that's been denied to them for too long. Ask yourself, what happens when a border is no longer defended by the barrel of a gun, but by the weight of a better future? What happens when the people of PoK begin to compare their lives not with the fantasies they've been sold, but with the progress across the border they've been taught to hate? The answer is simple. Walls built on lies begin to crack. And that's exactly what India is preparing for. Not a war of bombs, but a war of comparison. Today, while PoK suffers under misgovernance, censorship, and broken promises, Jammu and Kashmir is changing. Roads are being built, investments are flowing, tourism is returning, youth are starting startups, not riots. There's still work to be done, yes, but there is movement, there is direction. And for every stone that is replaced by a school, every curfew that is lifted by a job opportunity, a silent message travels across the loch. Look what's possible when your leaders don't lie to you. That is India's new front line: truth, opportunity, and visibility. Because sometimes the best way to free a people is not to storm their gates, but to shine a light so bright on your own side that the shadows next door can no longer hide their rot. This is not just geopolitics, it's personal. There are people living in India today whose ancestral homes are still standing or decaying. In PoK, there are temples and gurudwaras abandoned, graveyards untouched, scripts and languages fading away in occupied silence. These are not symbols of power, they are echoes of belonging, and belonging, once awakened, doesn't fade. It grows. It becomes intergenerational hunger, not for revenge, but for return. But return does not always mean military action, sometimes. It means creating such a stark contrast in governance, development, and international legitimacy that the very idea of being part of Pakistan begins to collapse from within. Already, whispers of discontent are surfacing. People in PoK questioning why their roads don't work, why their schools are underfunded, why their voices are censored. By India's Kashmir, the one they were told was burning, is slowly becoming a place of education and progress, while theirs remains a story of stagnation. This is India's real strategy, to make the truth louder than the lies. And in this effort, Israel's wisdom and experience serve as a quiet but sharp compass. They've shown what it means to reclaim not just lost territory, but lost dignity. How to win without becoming the aggressor. How to defend without becoming the invader. India is learning from that model, not to copy, but to adapt. Because every region has its own rhythm, its own complexities. But the principle remains. When your cause is just, you do not need to shout. You need only to persist. There may never be a dramatic moment where tanks roll through PoK with flags waving and cameras rolling. That's not the goal. The goal is that one day, when the final brick of that artificial wall crumbles, it will not be because India pushed. It will be because truth pulled. And when that moment comes, it will not be a scene of conquest, but of quiet homecoming. This is not a fantasy. It is the trajectory we are already witnessing. The world is shifting. Pakistan is weakening, not by invasion, but by its own weight. India is rising, not by force, but by focus. And as history